Hi lovelies, this is a quick video of me finishing a baby quilt for a friend. This was a really simple quilt, just one print fabric, one solid fabric. So I wanted everything to look especially nice with the simple design. So I actually hand quilted this one. I used pearl cotton to go around the cross design of the quilt. I think it came out looking really nice. There is just so much handwork that goes into finishing a quilt. You know, once you've made your quilt top, then you have to sandwich everything together. And your sandwich is your backing fabric, your batting, which is the soft, fluffy inner layer of the quilt, and then your top. And what I'm doing here in this clip is I'm actually basting that quilt sandwich at the edges in preparation to bind the edges of the quilt. I normally do this by hand. It just seems like everything just lays flatter, stays smoother. You can control that fabric and that batting layer. You can just control it better by doing it by hand. I've tried to do it by machine. I'm just not happy with what happens when I try to quilt on a machine. I've tried a lot of times. I've bought walking feet. I've done all the things. Maybe somebody out there has a trick they can teach me to where I can do a lot more finishing by machine. But I actually like the process of doing this. You're doing great big stitches, so it really doesn't take that long to do this. I normally just put on a podcast or some music or a movie and I just go for it. It doesn't take me that long. Even if it's a bigger quilt, basting is just a really simple big running stitch. Doesn't take that long. The other thing that I like to do that might be a little bit persnickety is I like to make my own quilt binding. Yes, you can definitely buy pre-packaged quilt binding, but here's the thing. Oftentimes the stuff is a little thick, it's a little hard to deal with, and your color selection is limited. If you make your own quilt binding, you will never go back. You will never go back to the pre-made stuff. You can make it in any color. It's not that difficult to process. It's literally a matter of cutting strips of fabric and using an iron to press them, fold them. It's really not that hard. I mean, you can see what I'm doing in the video. You fold it in half, and then you fold each half in half, and then you fold the whole thing over again. That's really all there is to it. And normally I have enough scraps when I get done making my backing. When I cut out that back piece of fabric that goes on the back side of the quilt, hence calling it the backing, I normally have enough scrap that I can cut out these binding strips. So I'm not actually wasting anything. You're using what you already have. You know, it's the whole theory of quilting is using scraps and bits and bobs that you have to make something really beautiful. So I think it works so well, and I'm so proud of myself here because normally when I make a quilt binding, I burn the devil out of myself with my steam iron, but this night it just went perfectly. I don't know what I was doing. I wish I could figure it out because like I said, normally I burn myself when I'm making my quilt binding. That's the only hazard of making this stuff, but I'm sure you are not as klutzy as I am and you do not burn yourself when you iron. Maybe that's just me. But it really doesn't take that much effort. It's just time. And again, it's one of those things where I put on a movie, I listen to a podcast, I put on some music, and I just, let my hands have a little bit of a mindless activity. Quilting always seems so daunting. It seemed like a huge undertaking when I first started learning how to make quilts. And it's really just a process of breaking things up into steps. You cut your squares, you make your top, maybe you make your binding. I normally make my binding after I've sandwiched everything together because that way I can measure and make sure that I have exactly enough binding for my quilt. But I would tell anybody to give quilting a shot. It's really not that hard. It's just a fair amount of math and patience. It's really all it is. Now that all the prep work is done, we can get down to finishing this quilt. I start by pinning the bias binding to the front of my quilt. I do probably use a lot of pins compared to some people, but I do tend to sew quickly on my machine, and having to stop and remove the pins as I sew slows me down and makes me pay attention to what I'm doing. So yes, the last little bit of machine sewing that I get to do is I do sew the binding to the quilt by machine. I have sewn it down by hand. On this particular quilt, I had a deadline, and so I made that executive decision that I was going to sew it down with my machine. Having the edges of the quilt basted really helped because it kept everything lying nice and flat. I had no puckering, I had no shifting, I had no moving. Hallelujah, it's a miracle. And once I have that binding sewn on, flip the quilt over, flip the binding over the edge of the quilt. Now the raw edge of that quilt is covered. Now we're down to the last stretch of hand sewing. And this is where you have to do a little bit more prep work. I swear to goodness, I probably said prep work on here way too many times, but you really, really, really need to do this little thing that I'm doing here, which is I am running my hand sewing thread through some wax, and that's what that stuff is. It's called Thread Magic. It's sold all over the place. But you run your thread over that wax, and it actually conditions your thread. It makes the thread a little bit stronger. It smooths out the fiber in the thread, and it also keeps that thread from knotting as much as it normally would try to. And it's magic. It's called Thread Magic for a reason. And once I discovered that, my hand sewing got to another level. And after that, it's honestly just a whole bunch of what they call like invisible hem stitches. I like to do this part by hand because it is a beautiful finishing method. I know a lot of people on the internet will show you where you just flip that quilt over, sew it down by machine, call it a day. You can do that. If it was one I was making for myself and I really didn't care, I just wanted to bind it and get it done. And I've done that in the past for myself. I wouldn't do this step, but most of the time if I'm making something for somebody else and it's going to be a gift, I do this little extra bit of effort. Plus, again, the design on this quilt is so simple that I really wanted the finishing to be really nice, because it's those little touches like that that make a quilt beautiful. And when I'm giving something for a gift, I always probably put way more effort into it than it probably warrants, but I always feel like giving a quilt away is like giving away a piece of your soul. So there it is. There's the finished product. I was really happy with this one. I wish I knew how many baby quilts I've made at this point. Have no clue, but this one is definitely in my top 5. It's simple, but I think kind of elegant and really beautiful, and written to a really, really sweet baby girl. And her parents seemed to really like it. Of course, she's a baby. She doesn't care. But I was really happy with this one. So, hope you enjoyed this little process video. I enjoyed filming it for you. And always, Thank you for watching.